Amadeo Bordiga 1926. Draft Theses for the Third Congress of the Communist Party of Italy. Presented by the Left. The Lyons Theses, 1926. Theses on the Tactics of the Communist International, presented at the Fourth Congress of the Communist International. Published in number 16 of the Stato Operaio on June 3, 1924. Program of Action of the Communist Party of Italy, presented at the Fourth Congress of the Communist International. Published in the above-mentioned issue of Stato Operaio. Motions and Theses approved at the National, Consultative, Conference of the Communist Party of Italy in May 1924, published in Stato Operaio, number 16 on March 18, 1924. Theses on the Tactics of the Communist International, presented at the Fifth World Congress. Published, in French and German, in the Congress Bulletin, number 20, August 7, 1924. General Questions. 1. Principles of Communism. The key doctrines of the Communist Party are founded on Marxism, which the struggle against opportunist deviations reinstated and set in place as the cornerstones of the Third International. These consist of dialectical materialism as the method of conceiving of the world and human history, the fundamental doctrines contained in Marx's Capital as method of interpretation of present-day capitalist economy, the programmatic formulations of the Communist Manifesto as the historical and political plan of emancipation of the world working class, the magnificent victorious experience of the Russian Revolution, and the work of its leader Lenin, master of international communism, constitute the confirmation, the restoration and the consequent development of this system of principles and methods. It is not possible to be a communist or to militate in the ranks of the International if even one part of this is rejected. Consequently, the Communist Party rejects and condemns the doctrines of the dominant class, which range from spiritualistic and religious theories, idealist in philosophy and reactionary in politics, to those which are positivist and of a free-thinking Voltairean variety, and anti-clerical and democratic in the realm of politics. It likewise condemns certain political schools which have a following amongst the working class, social democratic reformism, which cherishes peaceful transition, without armed struggle, from capitalist to workers' power, invoking class collaboration, syndicalism, which depreciates the political activity of the working class and the need for the party as supreme revolutionary organ, anarchism, which denies the historical necessity of the state and of the proletarian dictatorship as the means whereby the social order is transformed and class division suppressed. The Communist Party likewise opposes the many manifestations of spurious revolutionism which aim to resuscitate such tendencies by mingling them with communist theses, a danger that is designated by the now well-known term centrism. 2. Nature of the party. The historical course of the proletariat's emancipation and the foundation of a new social order derives from the existence of the class struggle. Every class struggle is a political struggle, that is to say, it has the tendency to end up as a struggle for the conquest of political power and control of the new state organism. Consequently, the organ which leads the class struggle to its final victory is the class political party, which is the sole possible instrument firstly of revolutionary insurrection and then of government. From these simple but brilliant assertions of Marx, brought into maximum relief by Lenin, arises the definition of the party as an organization of all those who are conscious of the system of opinions in which is summed up the historical task of the revolutionary class and who have decided to work for the victory of this class. Thanks to the party, the working class acquires the knowledge of the way forward and the will to take it. Historically, the party therefore represents the class in the successive stages of the struggle, even if only a greater or smaller part of the class is regrouped in its ranks. This equates with how Lenin defined the party at the Second World Congress. Marx and Lenin's conception of the party stands in sharp contrast to the typically opportunist conception of the laborist or workerist party to whom all those individuals who are proletarian in terms of their social condition are admitted by right. Within such a party, even if exhibiting an apparent numerical strength, there may, and indeed in certain conditions there will, prevail the direct counter-revolutionary influence of the dominant class, a class represented by the dictatorship of the organizers and leaders who as individuals can derive just as well from the proletariat as from other classes. This is why Marx and Lenin fought against this fatal theoretical error, and never hesitated to break up false proletarian unity in practice in order to ensure, even during moments when the social activity of the proletariat was eclipsed, and even by way of small political groups of adherents of the revolutionary program, that there would be continuity of the political function of the party in preparation for the subsequent tasks of the proletariat. This is the only possible way to achieve in the future the concentration of the greatest possible section of workers around the leadership and under the banner of a communist party capable of fighting and winning. An immediate organization of all workers on an economic basis cannot take on political, that is revolutionary, tasks since the separate and localized professional groups feel impelled to satisfy only the partial demands that arise as a direct consequence of capitalist exploitation. Only with the direct intervention at the head of the working class of a political party, defined by the political adherence of its members, do we find the progressive synthesis of these particular impulses into a common vision and activity, whereby individuals and groups are enabled to go beyond all particularism and accept difficulties and sacrifices for the final and general triumph of the working class cause. The definition of the party as class party of the working class has a final and historical value for Marx and Lenin, not a vulgarly statistical and constitutional one. Any conception of the problems of internal organization that leads to the error of the laborist conception of the party reveals a serious theoretical deviation, inasmuch as it substitutes a democratic vision for a revolutionary one, and attributes more importance to utopian schemes for designing new organizations than to the dialectical reality of the collision of forces between the two opposed classes. In other words, it represents the danger of relapsing into opportunism. As regards the perils of degeneration of the revolutionary movement, and of the means to guarantee the required continuity of the political line and its leaders and members, these dangers can't be eradicated with organizational formulae. Less still is it possible to eliminate them with the formula which states that only authentic workers can be communist, a position contradicted in our own experience by the vast majority of examples, relating to both individuals and parties. The aforementioned guarantee must be sought elsewhere if we don't wish to contradict the fundamental Marxist postulate: the revolution isn't a question of forms of organization, a postulate in which are summed up all the conquests achieved by scientific socialism with respect to the first trendings of utopianism. Our resolution to the current problems regarding the internal organization of the International and the party set out from these conceptions on the nature of the class party. 3. Party tactics and party action. The way the party operates in response to specific situations, and relates to other groups, organizations, and institutions of the society in which it moves, constitute its tactics. The general elements of this question must be defined in relation to our overall principles. It is then possible, on a secondary level, to establish concrete norms of action in relation to different types of practical problems and the successive phases of historical development. By assigning to the revolutionary party its place and its role in the genesis of a new society, the Marxist doctrine provides the most brilliant of resolutions to the question of freedom and determination in the activity of mankind. When extended to the abstract individual, however, the question will continue to furnish material for the metaphysical lucubrations of the philosophers of the ruling and decadent class for years to come. Marxism on the other hand situates the problem in the correct light of a scientific and objective conception of society and history. The idea that the individual, and indeed in one individual, can act on the outside world and shape it and mold it at will as though the power of initiative partook of some kind of divine inspiration is a million miles from our view. We equally condemn the voluntarist conception of the party according to which a small group of men, after having forged for themselves a profession of faith, proceed to spread and impose it by a gigantic effort of will, activity and heroism. It would, on the other hand, be a stupid and aberrant conception of Marxism to believe that the course of history and revolution proceed according to fixed laws, with nothing remaining for us to do apart from discovering what these laws might be through objective research and attempting to formulate predictions about the future whilst attempting nothing in the domain of action. The upshot of this fatalist conception is to annul the function of the party and indeed its very existence. Marxist determinism doesn't attempt to find a solution halfway between these two solutions, but in its powerful originality rises above them both. Because it is dialectical and historical, it rejects all a priorisms and doesn't claim to be able to apply, regardless of the historical epoch or the human groupings under consideration, one abstract solution to every problem. If the current development of the sciences does not allow for a complete investigation of what induces the individual to act, starting with physical and biological facts to arrive at a science of psychological activity, it is nevertheless possible to resolve the problem in the field of sociology by applying to the problem, like Marx, the methods of investigation appropriate to experimental and positive science fully inherited by socialism and which are quite different from the self-styled materialistic and positivist philosophy adopted during the historical advance of the bourgeois class. By taking rational account of the reciprocal influences between individuals, through the critical study of economy and history, after having cleared the decks of every prejudice contained in the traditional ideologies, we can in a certain sense remove indeterminacy from the processes operating within each individual. With this as its point of departure, Marxism has been able to establish an ideological system that isn't an immutable and fixed gospel, but a living instrument that enables the laws of the historical process to be followed and recognized. By means of the economic determinism discovered by Marx, which forms the basis of this system, the study of economic forms and relationships, and the development of the technical means of production, provides us with an objective platform on which to make soundly based enunciations about the laws of social life, and, to a certain degree, make predictions about its subsequent development. With this duly recorded, we must emphasize that the final solution doesn't mean we can say that having discovered the universal key, we may let economic phenomena follow their own immanent law and a predictable and established series of political facts will inevitably take place. Undoubtedly our critique is tantamount as completely and definitely devoiding of any meaning the aims and perspectives individuals had in historical events, even when such individuals are considered protagonists of historical deeds, although this does not completely apply to their actions. This, however, does not imply that a collective organism, such as the class party, could not, and should not, express initiatives of its own or have its own will. The solution we get to is countless times expressed in our fundamental texts. Humanity, and its most powerful groupings such as classes, parties and states, have moved almost as if they were playthings in the grip of economic laws, up to now almost entirely unknown to them. These groupings at the same time have lacked theoretical awareness of the economic process, and the possibility of managing and controlling it. However, the class that appears in the present historical epoch, the proletariat, and the political groupings, which inevitably emanate from it the party and the state, for them the problem, is modified. This is because the proletariat is the first class that isn't driven to base its rise to power on the consolidation of social privileges and class divisions, the first not to subject and exploit another class anew, whilst at the same time, it is the first that manages to shape a doctrine of the social and historical development of the economy, in other words, Marxist communism. For the first time then, a class fights for the suppression of classes in general and the suppression of private property and the means of production in general, rather than fighting for the mere transformation of the social forms of property. The proletariat's program, together with its emancipation from the present dominant and privileged classes, is the emancipation of the human collectivity from bondage to the laws of economy, which once understood, can be dominated within an economy which is finally rational and scientific, and which is subject to the direct intervention of man. This is what Engels meant when he wrote that the proletarian revolution marks the passage from the world of necessity to the world of freedom. This does not mean that we resuscitate the illusory myth of individualism, which wishes to liberate the human ego from external influences, especially since these influences tend to become ever more complex and the life of the individual ever more an indistinguishable part of a collective life. On the contrary, the parameters of the problem are changed, with will and freedom attributed to a class destined to become the unitary human grouping itself, a grouping which one day will struggle against the adverse forces of the external physical world alone. Whilst only proletarian humanity, still in the future for us, will be free and capable of a will isn't sentimental illusion but the capacity to organize and master the economy in the broadest sense of the word, and whilst it is true that the proletarian class today still has the extent of its activity determined by influences external to it, though less so than other classes, the organ in which, on the contrary, is summed up the full extent of volitional possibilities and initiative in all fields of activity is the political party. Not just any old party though, but the party of the proletarian class, the Communist Party, linked as though by an unbroken thread to the ultimate goals in the future. The party's power of volition, as well as its consciousness and theoretical knowledge or functions that are exquisitely collective. Marxism explains that the leaders in the party itself are given their job because they are considered as instruments and operators who best manifest the capacity to comprehend and explain facts and lead and will action, with such capacities nevertheless maintaining their origin in the existence and character of the collective organ. By way of these considerations, the Marxist conception of the party and its activity, as we have stated, thus shuns fatalism, which would have us as passive spectators of phenomena into which no direct intervention is felt possible. Likewise, it rejects every voluntarist conception, as regards individuals, according to which the qualities of theoretical preparation, force of will, and the spirit of sacrifice, in short, a special type of moral figure and a requisite level of purity, set the required standards for every single party militant without exception, reducing the latter to an elite, distinct and superior to the rest of the elements that compose the working class. The fatalist and passivistic error, though it might not necessarily lead to negating the function and the utility of the party, at the very least would certainly involve adapting the party to a proletarian class that is understood merely in a statistical and economic sense. We can sum up the conclusions touched on in the preceding theses as the condemnation of both the workerist conception, and that of an elite of an intellectual and moral character. Both these tendencies are aberrations from Marxism which end up converging on the slippery slope to opportunism. In resolving the general question of tactics on the same terrain as that of the nature of party, the Marxist solution must be distinguished both from that doctrinal estrangement from the reality of the class struggle which contents itself with abstract lucubrations, whilst negating concrete activity, and from sentimental aestheticism, which aspires, with the noisy gestures and heroic posturing of tiny minorities, to bring about new situations and historical movements. Also, it must be distinguished from opportunism, which neglects to link with principles, that is with the general scope of the movement, and, keeping in view only an immediate and apparent success, is content to clamor for isolated and limited demands without bothering about whether these contradict the necessity of preparing for the supreme conquests of the working class. The mistake of anarchist politics derives both from a doctrinal sterility, in its incapacity to comprehend the dialectical stages of real historical evolution, and from its voluntarist illusions, which cherish the fond hope of being able to speed up social processes by the force of example, and of sacrifices made by the one or the many. The mistake of social democratic politics derives as much from a false conception of Marxism in holding that the revolution will mature slowly of its own accord, without a revolutionary insurrection willed by the proletariat, as it does from a voluntarist pragmatism, which, unable to relinquish the immediate results of its day-to-day initiatives and interventions, is happy to struggle for objectives which are of only superficial interest to proletarian groups. For once obtained, these objectives merely become parts of the game of conserving the dominant class rather than serving as preparation for the victory of the proletariat. Such objectives are the partial reforms, concessions and advantages, both political and economic, obtained from the bosses and the bourgeois state. The artificial introduction into the class movement of the theoretical dictates of modern voluntarist and pragmatist philosophy, Bergson, Gentile, Croce, based on idealism, can only but prepare the opportunist affirmation of new waves of reformism. It cannot be passed off as reaction to reformism just because it demonstrates a superficial liking for bourgeois positivism. The party cannot and must not restrict its activity either to merely conserving the purity of theoretical principles and organizational structure, or to achieving immediate successes and a numerical popularity regardless of the cost. At all times and in all places, it must consolidate the following 3 points. A. The defense and clarification of the fundamental programmatic postulates, that is, the theoretical knowledge of the working class movement, in relation to new events as they arise. B. The assurance of the continuity of the organizational unity and efficiency of the party, and its defense against contamination by extraneous influences opposed to the revolutionary interests of the proletariat. C. The active participation in all the struggles of the working class, including those that arise out of partial and limited interests, in order to encourage their development. Emphasis however must constantly be placed on the factor of their links with the final revolutionary aims, and with the conquests of the class struggle presented as stepping stones on the way to the indispensable combat to come. This means denouncing the perils of abandoning ourselves to partial accomplishments as though they were points of arrival, and the danger of bartering these for the conditions of class activity and combativity of the proletariat, which are the autonomy and independence of its ideology and its organizations, most important of which is the party. The supreme purpose of this complex party activity is the creation of the subjective conditions for the proletariat's preparation, so that it is in a position to profit from revolutionary possibilities as soon as history presents them, and emerge from the struggle victor rather than vanquished. All this is the point of departure for responding to the questions of the relations between the party and the proletarian masses, the party and other political parties, and the proletariat and other social classes. We must consider the following tactical formulation wrong. All true communist parties should in all situations strive to be mass parties, that is to say, always be organizations with huge memberships and a very widespread influence over the proletariat, such as to at least exceed that of the other self-styled workers' parties. Such a proposal is a caricature of Lenin's practical, relevant and eminently appropriate watchword of 1921, namely, in order to conquer power, it isn't sufficient to form genuine communist parties and launch them into the insurrectionary offensive, because what is needed are numerically powerful parties with a predominating influence over the proletariat. In other words, before the conquest of power, and in the period leading up to it, the party must have the masses with it, must first of all conquer the masses. Such a formulation only becomes rather dangerous when used in conjunction with the notion of the majority of the masses, since it lends itself amongst chapter and verse Leninists, now as in the past, to the danger of a social democratic interpretation of theory and tactics, for although expressing the perfectly correct idea that the dangerous practice of engaging in reckless actions with insufficient forces, or when the moment isn't ripe, must be avoided, the unspecificness about how the majority is to be measured, that is whether in the parties, the unions or other organs, gives rise to the opposite danger of being diverted from action when it is both possible and appropriate, that is, at times when truly Leninist resolution and initiative is required. The formula which states that the party must have the masses with it on the eve of the struggle has now become a typically opportunist formula in the facile interpretation of today's pseudo-Leninists when they assert that the party must in all situations be a mass party. There are objective situations when the balance of forces are unfavorable to revolution, although perhaps closer to the revolution in time than others. Marxism teaches us that historical evolution takes place at very different rates. In these situations, the wish to be the majority party of the masses and enjoy an overriding political influence at all costs, can only at such times be achieved by renouncing communist principles and methods and engaging in social democratic and petty bourgeois politics instead. It must be emphatically stated that in certain situations, past, present and future, the proletariat does, and inevitably will adopt a non-revolutionary stance, either a position of inertia, or collaboration with the enemy as the case may be, but despite everything, The proletariat everywhere and always remains the potentially revolutionary class entrusted with the revolutionary counterattack, but this is only insofar as within it there exists the Communist Party and where, without ever renouncing coherent interventions when appropriate, this party avoids taking paths, which although apparently the easiest routes to instant popularity, would divert it from its task and thereby remove the essential point of support for ensuring the proletariat's recovery. On dialectical and Marxist grounds such as these, and never on aesthetic and sentimental grounds, we reject the bestial expression of opportunism that maintains that a communist party is free to adopt all means and all methods. By some it is said that precisely because the party is truly communist, sound in principles and organization, it can indulge in the most acrobatic of political maneuverings. But what this assertion forgets is that the party itself is both factor and product of historical development, and the even more malleable proletariat is yet more so. The proletariat will not be influenced by the contorted justifications for such maneuvers offered by party leaders but by actual results, and the party must know how to anticipate these results mainly by using the experience of past mistakes. It is not just by theoretical credos and organizational sanctions that the party will be guaranteed against degeneration, but by acting correctly in the field of tactics, and by making a determined effort to block off false paths with precise and respected norms of action. Within the tactical sphere there is another error which clearly leads back to the classical opportunist positions dismantled by Marx and Lenin. This consists in asserting that in the case of struggles between classes and political organizations which take place outside the party's specific terrain, the party must choose the side which represents the development of the situation most favorable to general historical evolution, and should more or less openly support and coalesce with it. The pretext for this is that the conditions for a complete proletarian revolution, to be set in motion by the party when the time comes, will have arrived solely when there has been a sufficient maturation and evolution of political and social forms. For a start, the very presuppositions that lie behind such politics are at fault. The typical scheme of a social and political evolution, fixed down to the smallest detail, as allegedly providing the best preparation for the final advent of communism belongs to the opportunist brand of Marxism, and is the basis on which the various Kotskys set about defaming the Russian Revolution and the present communist movement. It isn't even possible to establish in a general way that the most propitious conditions for Communist Party work to bear fruit are to be found under certain types of bourgeois regime, for example the most democratic. For whilst it is true that the reactionary and right-wing measures of bourgeois governments have often obstructed the proletariat, it is no less true, and in fact occurs far more often, that the liberal and left-wing politics of bourgeois governments have also stifled the class struggle and diverted the working class from taking decisive action. A more accurate evaluation, truly conforming with Marxism's breaking of the democratic, evolutionist and progressive spell, maintains that the bourgeoisie attempts, and often succeeds, in alternating its methods and parties in government according to its counter-revolutionary interests. All our experience shows us that whenever the proletariat gets enthusiastic about the vicissitudes of bourgeois politics, opportunism triumphs. Secondly, even if it were true that certain changes of government within the present regime made the further development of proletarian action easier, there is clear evidence that this would depend on one express condition, the existence of a party which had issued timely warnings to the masses about the disappointment which would inevitably follow what had appeared to be an immediate success. Indeed, not just the existence of the party, but its capacity to take action, even before the struggle to which we refer, in a manner which is clearly perceived as autonomous by proletarians, who follow the party not on the basis of schemes which it might be convenient to adopt at an official level but because of the party's down-to-earth attitude. When faced with struggles unable to culminate in the definitive proletarian victory, the party doesn't turn itself into a manager of transitional demands and accomplishments which are not of direct interest to the class it represents, and neither does it barter away its specific character and autonomous activity in order to become a kind of insurance society for all the political renewal movements or political systems and governments under threat from an allegedly worse government. The requirements of this line of action are often falsified by invoking both Marx's formulation that communists support any movement directed against existing social conditions, and the whole of Lenin's doctrine directed against the infantile disorder of communism. The speculations attempted on these declarations of Marx and Lenin within our movement are substantially similar to analogous speculations continually indulged in by the revisionists and centrists of the Bernstein and Nenni stamp, who in the name of Marx and Lenin have mocked revolutionary Marxism. We must make two observations. First of all, Marx's and Lenin's positions have a contingent historical value since they refer in Marx's case to a pre-bourgeois Germany, and in Lenin's case, as illustrated in left-wing communism, an infantile disorder, to the Bolshevik experience in Tsarist Russia. We shouldn't base our resolution of tactical questions under classical conditions, that is the proletariat in conflict with a fully developed capitalist bourgeoisie, on these foundations alone. Secondly, the support to which Marx refers, and Lenin's compromises. Lenin is a great Marxist dialectician and champion of real, non-formal intransigence, aimed and directed at an immutable goal, liked to flirt with such terms. Our support in compromises with movements still forced to clear the way forward with their insurrection against past social formations, even if this does contradict their ideology and the long-term aims of their leaders. The intervention of the Communist Party therefore occurs as an intervention in the setting of a civil war, and this explains Lenin's positions on the peasant and the national question, during the Kornilov affair and in 100 other cases. These two key observations aside, neither Lenin's criticism of infantilism, nor any Marxist text on the suppleness of revolutionary politics, was ever meant to undermine the barrier deliberately erected against opportunism, defined by Engels, and later by Lenin, as absence of principles, or obliviousness of the final goal. Constructing communist tactics with a formalist rather than a dialectical method is a repudiation of Marx and Lenin. It is, therefore, a major error to assert that means should correspond to the ends not by way of their historical and dialectical succession in the process of development, but depending on similarities and analogous aspects that means and ends may assume in a certain immediate sense, and which we might call ethical, psychological and aesthetic. We don't need to make in the field of tactics the mistake made in the realm of principle by anarchists and reformists, to whom it seems absurd both that suppression of classes and state power is prepared by way of the predominance of the proletarian class and its dictatorship, and that abolition of all social violence is realized by employing both offensive and defensive revolutionary violence, revolutionary towards the existing power and conservative towards the proletarian power. And it would be just as mistaken to make the following assertions, that a revolutionary party must support every struggle without taking into account the strengths of friends and foes, that communists must inevitably champion a strike to the bitter end, and that communists must shun certain means of dissimulation, trickery, espionage etc., because they aren't particularly noble or pleasant. Marxism and Lenin's critique of the superficial pseudo-revolutionism that fouls the path of the proletariat consists of attempts to eliminate these stupid and sentimental criteria as ways of resolving the problem of tactics, and their critique is now a definitively acquired experience of the communist movement. One tactical error that this critique allows us to avoid is the following: that since communists aim for a political split with the opportunists, we should therefore support splitting off from trade unions led by supporters of the Yellow Amsterdam Union. It is merely polemical trickery that has misrepresented the Italian left as basing its conclusions on notions like it is undignified to meet the opportunist leaders in person, and so on. The critique of infantilism doesn't however mean that indeterminacy, chaos and arbitrariness must govern tactics, or that all means are appropriate for achieving our aims. To say that harmony between the means employed, and the ultimate objective, is guaranteed by the revolutionary nature of the party, and by the contributions that eminent men or groups backed up by a brilliant tradition will bring to its decision-making is just a non-Marxist playing with words, because it doesn't take into account the repercussions on the party which its actions will have in the dialectical play of cause and effect. It also ignores the fact that Marxism ascribes no value whatsoever to the intentions that dictate the initiatives of individuals or groups, and the bloody experience of the past means we cannot avoid being suspicious about what lies behind these intentions, though we don't mean that in an insulting way. In his pamphlet on the infantile disorder of communism, Lenin wrote that the tactical means must be chosen in advance in order to fulfill the final revolutionary objective and governed by a clear historical vision of the proletarian struggle and its final goal. He showed it would be absurd to reject some tactical expedient just because it seemed nasty or was deserving of the definition compromise, and that it was, on the contrary, necessary to decide whether or not each tactic fitted in with achieving this final goal. The collective activity of the party and the Communist International poses and will continue to pose this formidable task. In matters of theoretical principle we can say that Marx and Lenin have bequeathed us a sound heritage, although that isn't to say that there aren't any new tasks of theoretical research for communism to accomplish. In tactical matters, on the other hand, we can't say the same, even after the Russian Revolution and the experience of the first years of the life of the new international, which was deprived of Lenin all too soon. The question of tactics is much too complex to be resolved by the simplistic and sentimental answers of communist infantiles, and it requires in-depth contributions from the whole of the international communist movement in the light of its experience, old and new. Marx and Lenin aren't being contradicted if we state that in order to resolve this question, rules of conduct must be followed which, whilst not as vital and fundamental as principles, are nevertheless binding both on party members and the leading organs of the movement, who should forecast the different ways in which situations may develop so as to plan with the greatest possible degree of accuracy how the party should act when one of these hypothetical scenarios assumes specific dimensions. Comprehending and weighing up the situation has to be the key requirement for making tactical decisions, because this allows us to signal to the movement that the time has come for an action which has already been anticipated as far as possible. It doesn't however allow arbitrary improvisations and surprises on the part of the leaders. We can't predict with absolute certainty how objective situations will turn out, but we can predict what we should do in certain hypothetical situations, that is to say, we can predict tactics in their broad outlines. To deny this possibility and necessity would be to deny both a fundamental party duty, and to reject the only assurance we can give that in all circumstances party militants and the masses will agree to take orders from the leading center. In this sense the party is not like an army or any other state mechanism, for in these organs hierarchical authority prevails and voluntary adhesion counts for nothing. We perhaps state the obvious when we say that there will always be a way left open, incurring no penalties, for party members not to obey orders, that is, simply leaving the party. Good tactics are as follows: in a given situation, even when the leading center doesn't have time to consult the party, still less the masses, the tactics are such that they don't lead to unexpected repercussions inside the party itself and within the proletariat, and they don't go in a sense opposed to the success of the revolutionary campaign. The art of predicting how the party will react to orders, and which orders will be well received, is the art of revolutionary tactics. These tactics can only be relied upon if they collectively utilize the experiences of the past summed up in clear rules of action, and if the membership, having entrusted the fulfillment of this latter task to the leaders, is convinced that these will not betray their mandate and are genuinely and decisively, and not just apparently, engaged in the work of carrying out the movement's orders. We have no hesitation in saying that since the party itself is something perfectible but not perfect, much has to be sacrificed for clarity's sake to the persuasive capacity of the tactical norms, even if this does entail a certain schematization, for even when tactical schemes prepared by us collapse under the weight of circumstances, the matter is never remedied by relapsing into opportunism and eclecticism, but rather by renewed efforts to bring tactics back into line with the duties of the party. It isn't only the good party that makes good tactics, but good tactics that makes the good party, and good tactics have to be amongst those that everybody has chosen, and everybody has understood in their main outlines. Basically, what we are rejecting is that the difficult work of the party in collectively defining its tactical norms should be stifled by demands for unconditional obedience to one man, one committee, or one particular party of the International, and its traditional apparatus of leadership. The activity of the party takes on strategic aspects in the culminating moments of the struggle for power, at which point it assumes an essentially military character. Even in the preceding phase, the party's activity is not restricted merely to ideological, propagandist and organizational functions but consists, as we've already mentioned, of active participation in the various proletarian struggles. This being so, the system of tactical norms must therefore be constructed with the precise aim of establishing under what conditions the intervention and the activity of the party in such movements, its agitation in the life of proletarian struggles, harmonizes with the final revolutionary objective whilst simultaneously guaranteeing useful progress in the spheres of ideological, organizational and tactical preparation. In the next part, we will take particular problems and examine how our elaboration of the particular norms of communist activity relates to the present stage of development of the revolutionary movement. 2. International questions. 1. The constitution of the Third International. The crisis in the Second International caused by the war was resolved, completely and definitively, by the constitution of the Communist International, but whilst the formation of the Comintern certainly constituted an immense historical conquest from the organizational and tactical point of view, and from the point of view of the restoration of revolutionary doctrine, it did not however completely resolve the crisis in the proletarian movement. The Russian Revolution, the first glorious victory of the world proletariat, was a fundamental factor in the formation of the new international. However, owing to the social conditions in Russia, the Russian Revolution didn't provide the general historical model for revolutions in other countries in a tactical sense. This is because in the passage from feudal autocratic power to the proletarian dictatorship, there had been no epoch of political dominion by the bourgeois class, organized in its own exclusive and stable state apparatus. It is precisely for this reason that the historical confirmation of the conceptions of the Marxist program in the Russian Revolution has been of such enormous significance and of such great use in routing social democratic revisionism in the realm of principles. In the organizational field, however, the struggle against the Second International, an integral part of the struggle against global capitalism, hasn't met with the same success, and a lot of errors have been committed which have resulted in the communist parties not being as effective as objective conditions would have allowed. We are obliged to say the same when it comes to tactical matters, since many of the problems linked to the present lineup of forces, the bourgeoisie, modern parliamentary bourgeois state with a historically stable apparatus, and the proletariat, have not been resolved adequately, and this continues to be the case today. The communist parties haven't always obtained all they could have done from the proletarian offensive against capitalism, and from the liquidation of the social democratic parties, that is the political organs of the counter-revolutionary bourgeoisie. 2. World economic and political situation, 1926. The international situation today appears less favorable to the proletariat than in the immediate post-war years. From the economic point of view, we witness a partial restabilization of capitalism. However, we understand this stabilization only to mean only that certain parts of the economic structure have been contained, and not that a state of affairs has arisen which excludes the possibility, even in the immediate future, of new disturbances. There is still a marked capitalist crisis, and its definitive worsening is inevitable. In the political sphere, we witness a weakening of the revolutionary movement in almost every advanced country, counterbalanced, happily, by the consolidation of Soviet Russia and by the struggles of the colonial peoples against the capitalist powers. Such a situation presents a double danger, however. In the first place, by pursuing the erroneous method of situationism, a certain tendency towards Menshevism arises in the way the problems of proletarian action are evaluated. Secondly, if the pressure from genuine classist actions diminishes, the conditions which Lenin saw as necessary for a correct application of tactics in the national and peasant question risk being misapplied within the overall politics of the Comintern. The post-war proletarian offensive was followed by an employers' offensive against proletarian positions, to which the Comintern replied with the watchword of the United Front. There then arose the problem of the rise in various countries of democratic pacifist situations, which Comrade Trotsky correctly denounced as representing a danger of degeneration for our movement. We must avoid all interpretations of situations which present as a vital question for the proletariat the struggle between two parts of the bourgeoisie, the right and the left, and the too strict identification of these with socially distinct groups. The correct interpretation is that the dominant class possesses several governmental methods that are in essence reduced to two, the reactionary fascist method, and the liberal democratic method. Setting out from an analysis of economy, Lenin's theses have already reliably proved that the most modern strata of the bourgeoisie tend to unify not only the productive mechanism, but also their political defenses into the most decisive forms. It is therefore false to state that as a general rule the road to communism must pass through a stage of left-wing bourgeois government. If nevertheless such a case arose, the condition for proletarian victory would reside in a party tactic of marshalling against the illusions generated by the accession of such a left-wing government in continuous opposition, even during periods of reaction, to political democratic formations. 3. The International's method of work. One of the Communist International's most important tasks has been dispelling the proletariat's mistrust of political action, which arose as a result of the parliamentary degeneracies of opportunism. Marxism doesn't interpret politics as the art of using cunning techniques and parliamentary and diplomatic intrigues, to be used by all parties in pursuit of their special ends. Proletarian politics rejects the bourgeois method of politics and anticipates higher forms of relations culminating in the art of revolutionary insurrection. This rejection, which we will not present in greater theoretical detail here, is the vital condition both for the effective linking up of the revolutionary proletariat with its communist leadership, and for ensuring effective selection of personnel for the latter. The working methods of the International fly in the face of this revolutionary necessity. In the relations between the different organs of the communist movement a two-faced politics frequently gains the upper hand, and a subordination of theoretical rationale to fortuitous motives, and a system of treaties and pacts between persons which fails to faithfully convey the relations between the parties and the masses, has led to bitter disappointments. Improvisation, surprises, and theatrical scene changes, are factors that are entering all too easily into the major and fundamental decisions of the International, disorientating both comrades and the proletariat alike. For example, the majority of internal party questions are resolved in international organs and congresses by a series of unwieldy arrangements which make them acceptable to the various leadership groups but add nothing useful to the real process of party growth.